constraints-led approach to coaching skill acquisition in youth footballers. What we're going to discuss in this presentation is, firstly, skill acquisition in sport, a constraints-led approach to coaching a skill and a review of some of the literature, a constraints-led approach to coaching youth footballers, and a practical application of a constraints-led approach. But firstly, we're going to discuss some definitions of skill acquisition in sport. So skill acquisition is really how we acquire skills to perform a task. Williams and Ford defined skill acquisition as the science that underpins movement learning and execution, and is more commonly termed motor learning and control. Learning a skill is a complex and dynamic process. However, certain stages of skill learning have been broadly categorized into 3 stages by Fitz and Posner. These 3 stages are the cognitive stage, the associative stage, and the autonomous stage. So if we look at the table here, we can see a summary of Fitz and Posner's 3 stages of motor learning. So again, these are cognitive, associative, and autonomous. So the cognitive stage is the first stage of motor learning, and the main point or the main area around this is this process is gathering information at this stage. So it would need more instruction and guidance from coaches, and some of the characteristics of this stage would be large gains initially with inconsistent performance. Moving on to the associative stage, this stage is more about putting actions together, and there will be definitely some less verbal information from coaches in terms of its practical application. The gains will be smaller, and we would have disjointed performance, still with a conscious effort from the athletes. The autonomous stage, then, being the final stage, would require a lot of time and practice from the athletes, and processing demands in terms of this stage are minimal, and performance starts to seem unconscious, automatic, and smooth. Before we start to discuss a constraints-led approach, we'll first look at this graph, which kind of summarizes some of the ideas around the constraints-led approach from one of the people who was the first to discuss this, being Newell. And we can see here a diagram of his theory of constraints. So the main point we're going to look at first on this diagram is the triangle, where we can see three different points on that, where we have organismic constraints, environmental constraints, and task constraints. So just to look at these 3 areas in a little bit more detail. So when we're looking at organismic constraints, these are constraints that can be structural. So things like the athlete's height, their weight, or functional, and for example, their attention and motivation. So these are things that will be more individual to the athletes themselves. Moving on to then environmental constraints. So these will be constraints from outside the body. So things that we more easily manipulate ourselves and as coaches. So things like gravity and the surfaces that we're playing on. And then the last point being task constraints. So task constraints will be more related to the goals, tasks, and rules within the sessions themselves, or within the games or drills that we're providing, and how we're manipulating them for the athlete. Another key point to discuss when we're talking about a constraints-led approach, and again we can see, and it's evident on this diagram here, is the perception-action cycle. So the perception-action cycle is the continuous flow of information and action between the brain and the world around it. So before we make a decision or action, the prefrontal cortex is considering information from the posterior element of the brain, as well as memories and experience, and initiates appropriate movement. As the brain perceives the actions of the body, it either reinforces existing neural pathways for that action, or begins the new ones. So the development of movement solutions are created in the perception action cycle, and tasks should provide affordances for athletes and give opportunities for the development of effective perception and action. And just before we move on, some key ideas in practice around the constraints-led approach. So a coach's role in a constraints-led approach is largely hands-off in terms of explicit instruction. This was highlighted by Renshaw. Continued instruction given by the coach may influence the performer to rely on passively learning and rely on temporary solutions provided by the coach. So it is important that the coach who is taking the session understands that the level of information that they give may influence the amount of learning that goes on in that session. So it's not just the act of designing the drills that's important. It's important that the coach understands when to give instruction and when to leave the learning to the athletes themselves or the drills themselves. And the minimalistic approach used in a constraints-led approach forces the learner to actively self-organize and form effective movement patterns. So when we look at a lot of the research surrounding a constraints-led approach, self-organization is something that we would see discussed a lot. Again, before moving on to some of the literature, I just want to briefly look at some of the different styles of coaching and that may be slightly different to a constraints-led approach. So these two we're going to focus on here are blocked coaching and random coaching or practice. So blocked practice will be the repetition of a very specific task over and over until it begins to look like the desired outcome. Some examples of this would be change of direction drills or dribbling drills through cones, whatever it might be. And the other being random practice, which would have no specific goals or outcomes other than to improve, and would have very little structure involved. So games with no rules, so just letting a group of players play in an area without really any instruction at all, again with no rules. So this may seem similar in terms of a constraints-led approach, but it's different in that there will be no structure whatsoever really. And these two terms, just when we're looking at the research in the area of constraints-led approach, these can be often termed as traditional approaches or sometimes linear approaches to coaching. So when we look at some of the literature surrounding a constraints-led approach in a general sense, a review by Clark et al. Found that the majority of papers included in their reviews found a positive effect in skill acquisition following implementation of a constraints-led approach. Chapman showed that both a constraint-led approach and a traditional approach led to improvements in spin bowling, with the constraints-led approach being more effective overall, but especially for younger, less skilled spinners. A traditional approach, however, was shown to improve spin rate in more skilled bowlers. So this is just an important point from this study that although a lot of the literature would be comparing a constraints-led approach to more traditional approaches, it's important to recognize that just because a constraints-led approach or traditional approach may be better for one cohort of athletes or people, a different approach may be, even within the same sport, may be more beneficial when it comes to things like their age group or different factors. Again, if we take that back to more like organismic or individual traits, we need to be able to consider different styles of coaching for different cohorts at different times. Ramos et al. Concluded that their observation supports the assumption that variable behavior as a result of manipulation of constraints offers opportunities for adaptability among team sport athletes. And key point here being adaptability. So this is something that would be very important in team sports, as it's obviously a very uncontrolled environment in comparison to some other sports where it is more just about the specific skill itself. Decision making and adaptability is kind of a key area for team sport athletes. Williams and Hodges highlight the importance of variable and random practice conditions and argue that this may be there may be a reason why coaches may be more conservative when structuring practice if they prefer the stability and security of a grid or a drill over more dynamic processes. So this is an important point, because even if the evidence backs up that we should be using maybe a more constraints-led approach, some coaches may still stay away from this because they feel like it's not structured enough or it's a little bit harder to control in terms of the session, and they might prefer the stability of a certain drill or type of coaching. And when we look at a constraint-set approach to coaching youth athletes and some of the research in this area, we want to start with this paper by DeSanto et al. And if we look at the two diagrams, I think this gives a good visualization of the the two types of drills or types of practice that are discussed in a lot of the research. So if you look at the left-hand side of the slide here, we can see an example of a small side of games where we have got different grids with 2v2 games, and the goal in this game is still to improve the ability of the children's dribbling. However, this might not be said explicitly by the coaches. The goal of the children they might be just concerned with scoring and goals, or the drills that they would undertake in those type of drills. So that would be their focus. And whereas if you look at the drills on the right, we can see that the diagram shows what we would probably commonly think of when we think of like traditional or closed practice, where the children are just asked to dribble through the cones. They may be given a little bit more instruction in terms of technique or exactly how to do it, and it's a little bit more objective. If they hit a cone, they can see that they haven't done the skill as well. And for the conclusion in terms of this study would be that it proved to be more effective, and the constraint set approach proved to be more effective than the traditional approach in terms of improving the dribbling ability of the children. And again, they highlighted that this preliminary study should lead coaches to consider a variation or change of methodological approach based on the principles of a constraint set approach. Some other research around the area of constraint set approach in youth athletes. Almeida et al. Concluded that manipulating task constraints such as game rules can direct practitioners towards intended behaviours and consequently promote skill acquisition and improve performance in youth soccer. Dix and Chow found that under 13 youth footballers who practiced with the constraint-driven training protocol demonstrated significance in improving dribbling accuracy while reducing execution errors. But a study by Gonzalo Rodinez suggested that football coaches should consider the manipulation of pitch configuration to expose players to different spatial constraints and make them explore multiple solutions to create goal-scoring opportunities. So this was an interesting study where they looked at longer pitches, wider pitches, different types of pitches other than the normal, kind of standard pitch structure, and how that lent itself to different goal-scoring opportunities in the game, which is an important skill to be able to improve in athletes in terms of when players come up with being forced to come up with different solutions for scoring goals, which is obviously in most sports, especially field sports, the most important element in terms of winning. So they found that different pitch spaces afforded players opportunities to have to kind of figure out solutions to creating more goal scoring opportunities. And studies by Roberts et al. Supported a non-linear pedagogy in developing 1v1 gameplay and decision making, but not for technical shooting or shooting proficiency in youth athletes. So this was interesting, as they highlighted that a constraint-led approach may be better for developing 1v1 games, which is something that a part of the game that would involve a lot more decision making or problem solving. Whereas they didn't find it as beneficial for something like a more close skill like technical shooting proficiency. And again, this is where coaches themselves may need to consider when a constraint-led approach might be more beneficial, or whether a more traditional approach might be more beneficial for a certain group of athletes at a certain stage, or even just for a certain type of drill. Just to conclude then with some practical applications of a constraints-led approach. So some of the advantages around a constraints-led approach would be that the practice can be more specific to the game and promote more tactical awareness of the game, as a lot more of the coaching itself will be done through games. And skills learned through a constraints-led approach may have more transfer to the sport itself, and this is generally again through the fact that a lot more of the coaching will be done through games where the players have to figure out or problem solve for themselves, which is again the third point. It helps athletes to improve their decision making skills. So a lot of the coaching would be done, the aim would be for the athletes to be able to make those decisions themselves and to improve their skills. And some of the disadvantages may be that sessions may be harder to run from a coaching perspective, which we previously discussed. It's a little bit logistically, it may be a little bit tougher to maybe not plan your drills out as much, or things maybe to be a little bit more chaotic, which some coaches may not enjoy. and also it may take longer to develop the skills initially, especially in younger athletes, which is what we're discussing here. So that cognitive stage may take even a little bit longer, but again, it may then over time have better transfer, and it is harder to give objective feedback on skills in sessions, as it's not as clear whether the athlete is doing exactly what you want them to do right then, and it may be clear over time.